At my own son's wedding, they replaced my chair with a trash bin and told me to relax because it was just a prank. Margaret Whitmore heard the words as clearly as the soft clink of crystal glasses around her, though no one seemed to notice the way her fingers tightened around her evening clutch for half a second before relaxing again. The ballroom at the Hartford Regency shimmered with golden light. White roses climbing tall centerpieces, linen tablecloths pressed so perfectly they looked untouched, and a string quartet, playing something gentle and forgettable near the dance floor. It was supposed to be a beautiful night. She had chosen her navy silk dress weeks ago, the one Daniel once said made her look elegant, and fastened the pearl necklace her late husband had given her on their 40th anniversary. She had even arrived 20 minutes early, careful not to intrude, careful not to be too much, as Olivia once suggested with a polite smile. Her name card rested at the family table, printed in graceful calligraphy, Margaret Whitmore, mother of the groom. Only there was no chair. In its place sat a small stainless steel trash bin, lined with a crisp white bag as if prepared for cocktail napkins and discarded programs. A bridesmaid had laughed first, covering her mouth as if the laughter were an accident. "It's just a joke," she said brightly. Olivia thought it would lighten the mood. Daniel stood a few feet away, adjusting his cuff links, his smile thin and uncertain. "Mom, don't take it so seriously," he added, as though seriousness were the flaw. Margaret felt dozens of eyes slide toward her and then away again, the way people look at something uncomfortable but decide it is not their place to intervene. She noticed everything. The older couple from the country club who suddenly found their champagne fascinating. The distant cousin whispering behind her program. The wedding planner glancing down at her clipboard, confused. Margaret let a small smile settle on her face, the kind she had perfected over decades of hosting holiday dinners and smoothing over tensions before they could bloom into arguments. She placed her clutch carefully on the edge of the table and, without comment, moved the trash bin 2 inches to the side so she could rest her hand on the tablecloth. "I suppose I've always appreciated creativity," she said. Evenly, her voice neither raised nor trembling. The quartet continued to play. The waitstaff continued to circulate with trays of sparkling water and champagne. Life, it seemed, went on seamlessly around the insult. Inside, however, something quiet shifted into place. This was not the first small adjustment she had been asked to make. Not the first time her presence had been rearranged to accommodate someone else's comfort. She remembered the bridal shower she had not been invited to host. The rehearsal dinner menu changed without her input, though she was helping to cover the cost. The subtle way Olivia introduced her by first name instead of Daniel's mother. Each moment had been presented as harmless, modern, nothing to fuss about. Margaret had told herself the same. Tonight, standing beside a polished trash bin where her seat should have been, she understood with startling clarity that this was not about humor. It was about placement, about visibility, about reminding her, gently and publicly, where she stood in the new order of things. The applause began as the newlyweds were announced, bright and enthusiastic, and Margaret joined in, her hands moving steadily, her smile unwavering. If anyone expected tears or outrage, they would be disappointed. She had learned long ago that dignity, once surrendered, was rarely returned. And as Olivia swept past her in a cloud of white satin and curated innocence, Margaret realized something else. They believed the prank made her small. What it truly revealed was how carefully they had underestimated her. Margaret remained at the table long enough to make her composure unmistakable, applauding at the appropriate moments and offering polite congratulations as guests drifted past, though she did not miss the way several of them avoided meeting her eyes for more than a second. The reception unfolded with effortless elegance, waiters refilling water glasses before they were half empty, photographers circling the dance floor like quiet satellites, and Olivia glowing beneath the soft chandelier light as if the evening had been designed solely to frame her. Margaret observed everything with the calm attentiveness of someone who had once hosted fundraisers in her own backyard, who understood how much money and planning were required to make a night appear seamless. She knew precisely how much this wedding had cost because she had written the check for nearly half of it 6 months earlier, a gesture Daniel had accepted with visible relief and a promise that she would always have a place of honor. That promise now felt abstract, like a line spoken in a rehearsal that never made it into the final performance. When dinner was served, a young server hesitated beside her, clearly unsure where to set the plate. There was still no chair. Margaret solved the problem herself by stepping aside and allowing the plate to rest at the edge of the table, her posture straight, her movements deliberate, as though nothing were out of place. Across from her, Olivia laughed at something a bridesmaid whispered, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm. Daniel laughed too, but it sounded thinner than usual, stretched across the space between loyalty and convenience. Margaret studied her son with a detached clarity that surprised her. He looked handsome and successful, every inch the groom he had once dreamed of becoming. Yet there was a hesitation in his gaze whenever it drifted toward her and then away again. She realized that what unsettled him was not the prank itself, but the possibility that she might react in a way that would disrupt the perfection of the evening. He needed her cooperation more than he needed her comfort. The band shifted into a familiar love song, and couples rose from their seats, filling the dance floor with careful spins and polite applause. Margaret remained where she was, hands folded lightly, recalling another dance floor decades earlier when Daniel had stood on her toes as a child and insisted he could lead. She had let him believe it then. She had let him feel strong even when he was small. The memory did not sting, it clarified. Around her, conversations resumed, forks touched porcelain, and the soft hum of celebration continued as though dignity were a minor detail that could be rearranged like table decor. Margaret understood something important in that moment. Public disrespect rarely announces itself as cruelty. It arrives dressed as humor, as modern sensibility, as a test of how flexible one is willing to be. She had been flexible for years, adjusting her expectations, lowering her voice, trimming her presence to fit the margins offered to her. Tonight, she stopped adjusting. She did not confront. She did not accuse. Instead, she watched carefully, measuring not the insult but the character it revealed. And as the toasts began and glasses lifted in, sparkling arcs of light, Margaret felt a quiet certainty settle inside her. Respect, once withdrawn, reshapes more than a seating chart. It reshapes futures. When the master of ceremonies tapped his glass and invited the family to offer a few words, Margaret felt a subtle shift in the room, the kind that happens when attention gathers in one direction and waits. Olivia rose first, graceful and radiant, thanking everyone for coming and speaking warmly about new beginnings, about blending families, about love that grows stronger when surrounded by support. Her voice carried easily across the ballroom, polished and confident. Guests smiled, dabbed at the corners of their eyes, and nodded along. Daniel followed, his speech shorter, more restrained, speaking of loyalty and partnership, of building a future that honored the past while stepping forward. He glanced at his mother only once, briefly, as if checking whether she remained steady. She did. When the microphone was offered to her, there was a flicker of hesitation from Olivia, quickly concealed behind a bright expression. Margaret stood without hurry, smoothing the front of her dress, the pearls at her throat catching the light. She did not rush to the center of the dance floor. She walked there with the quiet assurance of someone who understood that presence is not volume. The room grew still in a different way now, not celebratory but curious. Margaret thanked the guests for witnessing a milestone, her voice clear and measured. She spoke of the day Daniel was born, of the small hospital room in early spring, of holding him for the first time, and realizing that love could rearrange an entire life in a single moment. She described teaching him to ride a bicycle on a quiet suburban street, running beside him until he insisted he could balance on his own. A few guests smiled at the image. Daniel shifted slightly, perhaps remembering the same afternoon. Margaret did not dwell in nostalgia. She moved gently toward the present, speaking of how marriage is not only a celebration but a responsibility, not only a promise but a reflection of character. She said that every family is built on something invisible yet unmistakable, something that cannot be purchased or staged. Respect, she said, is the foundation that keeps love from becoming performance. The words settled softly into the air. She did not accuse. She did not reference the evening's earlier adjustment. She simply continued, saying that in every gathering there are seats that symbolize belonging, and that belonging is not granted by title but maintained by conduct. Her tone never sharpened. It remained calm, almost tender. Yet the room seemed to grow smaller around the idea. When she finished, she lifted her glass and wished them wisdom as well as happiness. Applause followed, polite at first, and then more certain, as though the guests sensed something they could not fully articulate. Margaret returned the microphone and walked back toward the table, her steps unhurried. She noticed that someone had quietly replaced the trash bin with an actual chair while she had been speaking. She did not comment on it. She simply sat, folded her hands, and allowed the celebration to continue. But the shift in atmosphere was unmistakable. What had begun as light amusement now carried a trace of awareness. Daniel avoided her gaze again, though this time his expression held something closer to unease than embarrassment. Olivia's smile remained in place, but it required more effort to sustain. Margaret did not need confrontation. She had already placed something at the center of the room that could not be removed so easily. And as music resumed and guests returned to their conversations, she understood that certain truths, once spoken calmly, do more than fill silence. They rearrange it. The remainder of the reception unfolded with careful normalcy, as though the earlier tension had been absorbed into the polished floor and muted by the steady rhythm of the band. Margaret remained seated in the chair that had quietly replaced the earlier insult, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly in her lap. She noticed who approached her and who did not. An elderly aunt paused to squeeze her shoulder with a knowing look. A former colleague from Daniel's childhood school offered a warm compliment about her speech. Others maintained a cautious distance, uncertain how to navigate a shift they could feel but not define. Margaret did not pursue conversation. She listened. She watched. She catalogued. Olivia moved through the crowd with deliberate brightness, her laughter a fraction louder than necessary, her gestures expansive, as though the success of the evening depended on constant reinforcement. Daniel followed closely, attentive and agreeable, nodding at guests, thanking them for coming, repeating phrases that sounded rehearsed. From across the room, Margaret observed the dynamic. With the clarity that comes only after expectation has thinned, she remembered earlier seasons of adjustment. The first holiday dinner after Daniel introduced Olivia, when the menu Margaret had prepared was quietly supplemented with catered dishes without her knowledge. The small comment about how traditions could feel outdated. The gentle suggestion that modern families required less formality. None of it had seemed significant alone. Each moment had been framed as progress, as evolution, as something she ought to embrace. She had embraced it. She had stepped back from hosting. She had reduced her advice to silence. She had transferred financial decisions to Daniel when he insisted it was time. She had believed that accommodation preserved harmony. Tonight clarified a different truth. Accommodation, when unreciprocated, becomes erasure. As dessert was served in plates of layered cake circulated among the tables, Margaret excused herself from the ballroom with quiet efficiency. No one stopped her. No one questioned her departure. In the lobby, the air felt cooler, less saturated with perfume and applause. She paused beside a tall window overlooking the manicured lawn, where string lights traced gentle arcs against the night sky. For a moment she allowed herself stillness. Not grief. Not anger. Something steadier. A recalibration. She considered the practicalities waiting beyond the celebration. The trust established years earlier in Daniel's name. The property discussions scheduled for the fall. The financial structures she had once viewed as legacy now required reevaluation. Respect, she knew, was not an abstract sentiment. It was a condition. It influenced decisions, access, and continuity. Margaret reached into her purse and retrieved her phone, scrolling briefly before selecting a familiar contact. Harold Stein had managed her affairs for more than 2 decades. She did not call immediately. She saved the action for the following morning. Tonight required no dramatic gesture. It required clarity. She returned to the ballroom just long enough to collect her coat and offer a composed farewell to the nearest cluster of guests. When Daniel noticed her preparing to leave, he approached with a smile that struggled to hold its shape. He thanked her again for her words, for her support, for everything. Margaret looked at her son with an expression that carried neither accusation nor reassurance. She told him she wished him wisdom. Then she stepped into the cool night air, the door closing softly behind her, and for the first time that evening she felt the quiet weight of decision settle fully into place. The next morning arrived without ceremony. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Margaret's living room, illuminating the quiet order she had maintained for decades. The house felt steady, unchanged by the previous evening, as though walls and furniture had witnessed similar moments and chosen discretion. She rose at 6:30, as she always did, brewed her coffee, and carried the mug to the small oak desk near the window. Outside, the early autumn air inched toward crispness, leaves beginning to surrender their green. Margaret did not replay the reception in her mind with outrage. She reviewed it with precision. She remembered the laughter, the calculated brightness, the hesitation in Daniel's voice. She remembered the way the seating chart had been altered at the last minute. None of it felt accidental. She opened a leather folder that contained copies of her financial documents, organized with the same care she once devoted to school calendars and medical records. The Whitmore Family Trust, established 15 years earlier, had been designed to secure Daniel's future, to ensure stability, to provide support for property investments and eventual grandchildren. It had been an act of love, structured carefully with professional guidance. Margaret understood now that love, without boundaries, invites reinterpretation. She reached for her phone and dialed Harold Stein. His voice answered on the second ring, steady and familiar. Margaret did not dramatize. She informed him that she wished to review the terms of the trust immediately. She asked about conditional clauses, about discretionary disbursements, about amendments that reflected mutual conduct. Harold did not question her reasoning. He simply confirmed an appointment for that afternoon at 2 o'clock. After ending the call, Margaret placed the phone face down on the desk and allowed herself a moment of stillness. She did not feel vindictive. She felt precise. Around 10 o'clock, her phone vibrated with a message from Daniel. He thanked her again for attending, for speaking so graciously. He mentioned that Olivia had not intended any harm and that everyone had laughed. Margaret read the message twice. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she walked through her house, noting the photographs arranged along the hallway. Daniel as a toddler holding a toy truck. Daniel in a high school graduation gown. Daniel on the day he purchased his first home, pride evident in his posture. Each image captured effort, sacrifice, guidance. None of them captured entitlement. When she returned to her desk, she typed a brief reply. She wrote that she hoped he would reflect on what respect truly means within a family. She wished him a restful honeymoon and said nothing more. At 2 o'clock she arrived at Harold's office, a brick building 3 miles from her home, and sat across from him in a quiet conference room. She explained that she wanted the trust revised so that distributions required demonstrated mutual respect and responsible communication. She requested that discretionary authority remain solely in her hands until further notice. Harold nodded, making notes, outlining steps, explaining that the amendments could be completed within 48 hours. Margaret listened carefully, asking measured questions. When the meeting concluded, she signed the preliminary documents with steady handwriting. As she stepped back into the afternoon light, she felt neither anger nor triumph. She felt alignment. The previous evening had clarified something essential. Placement at a table is symbolic. Authority over one's legacy is not. And for the first time in years, Margaret understood that silence, when chosen deliberately, can carry more consequence than any raised voice. 2 days later the amendments were finalized, quiet lines of legal language adjusting decades of assumption without spectacle or announcement. Margaret returned home from Harold Stein's office with a slim folder tucked beneath her arm, the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across her driveway. The house greeted her with its usual stillness, the faint scent of lavender from the sachets she kept in the hallway drawers. She placed the folder on her desk, but did not open it again. She did not need to reread what she had already decided. The trust now required more than bloodline. It required conduct. Distributions would be discretionary, contingent upon mutual respect and consistent communication. Authority remained with her. Legacy, she understood, was not a reward for proximity. It was a reflection of character. That evening her phone rang just after 7 o'clock. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. Margaret allowed it to ring twice before answering. Her tone even, her greeting warm but measured. He sounded relaxed, the faint echo of a hotel room behind his voice. He spoke about the honeymoon suite overlooking the ocean, about the dinner reservations, about how everything had been perfect. Then his tone shifted, gently, almost imperceptibly. He mentioned that Olivia had felt unsettled by her speech, that some guests had interpreted it as pointed. Margaret listened without interruption. She did not defend herself. She asked one question instead. She asked whether he believed respect should be conditional or assumed. There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than necessary. Daniel responded carefully, saying that families sometimes misread humor. Margaret acknowledged that humor can reveal more than it conceals. She did not raise her voice. She did not mention documents or amendments. She told him she hoped his marriage would be built on clarity rather than convenience. When the call ended, she remained seated for a moment, considering the distance that had grown not overnight but gradually, through a series of small permissions she had granted. The following week, she received an email from Daniel requesting an early distribution from the trust to assist with a down payment on a larger home. The message was polite, framed as an investment opportunity that would benefit everyone. Margaret read it once, then again. She forwarded it to Harold with a brief instruction to respond formally. The reply outlined the updated terms and explained that all requests would now be evaluated based on sustained mutual respect and responsible communication. There was no accusation in the wording, only structure. Hours later, Daniel called again, confusion replacing ease. He asked when the changes had occurred. Margaret answered truthfully. She said that clarity often follows experience. She did not elaborate. She did not mention shares or jokes or the quiet replacement that had occurred mid-reception. She simply stated that she believed financial support should align with demonstrated values. Silence followed. This time it was not awkward. It was reflective. Margaret ended the call with the same composure she had carried through the wedding. She understood that authority, once exercised calmly, does not require repetition. In the weeks that followed, communication from Daniel became more careful, more intentional. Olivia's messages shifted in tone, offering invitations phrased with courtesy rather than expectation. Margaret accepted some, declined others. She did so without explanation. The balance had changed, not through confrontation, but through alignment. And as autumn settled fully over her neighborhood, leaves gathering in measured piles along the curb, Margaret recognized that dignity, when quietly defended, reshapes the space around it. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. By late October, the air had turned sharp enough to require a wool coat in the evenings, and Margaret found herself standing at her kitchen window, watching leaves tumble across the lawn in uneven spirals. The house remained orderly, unchanged in its quiet dignity, yet the rhythm of communication with Daniel had shifted in noticeable ways. His calls now began with measured courtesy, his tone deliberate, as though every word required inspection before release. Olivia's messages carried careful phrasing, invitations extended with formal politeness rather than assumption. Margaret responded in kind. She accepted a Sunday brunch invitation 3 weeks after the honeymoon, arriving precisely at 11 o'clock with a small bouquet of white chrysanthemums. The new house Daniel had mentioned in his email was still only a plan, a possibility suspended behind revised conditions. Margaret entered their current home with calm composure, observing subtle changes. Olivia greeted her warmly, perhaps more warmly than necessary, offering coffee and a seat at the dining table that had been set with deliberate symmetry. There was no humor woven into the seating this time, no casual commentary disguised as wit. Conversation unfolded cautiously at first. Daniel asked about her garden. Olivia complimented the chrysanthemums. Margaret listened, answering without embellishment. She noticed the effort behind their politeness, the careful absence of sharp edges. Midway through brunch, Daniel cleared his throat and addressed the trust directly. He admitted he had been surprised by the amendments. He said he had not understood that his behavior might have consequences beyond the immediate moment. Margaret regarded him steadily, her expression neither stern nor indulgent. She explained that responsibility does not vanish at celebration. She said that legacy is sustained through conduct, not entitlement. Her voice remained even, but the words carried weight. Olivia interjected gently, suggesting that misunderstandings happen in modern families, that humor can sometimes misfire. Margaret acknowledged the possibility. She added that misjudgment is forgivable when accompanied by reflection. Silence settled briefly across the table, not hostile but contemplative. Daniel spoke again, this time without deflection. He apologized for dismissing her discomfort that evening. He admitted that he had prioritized the appearance of ease over her dignity. The apology was not dramatic. It was measured, perhaps incomplete, but sincere enough to register. Margaret inclined her head slightly. She did not rush to absolve him. She said that respect must become habit, not exception. The conversation continued, lighter now, though a new awareness lingered beneath it. When brunch concluded, Daniel walked her to her car. The autumn sun cast pale light across the driveway, illuminating fallen leaves like scattered copper coins. He thanked her for coming and for listening. Margaret placed her hand briefly on his arm, the gesture steady and restrained. She told him that strength is proven in correction, not denial. As she drove home, she reflected not on victory, but on alignment. Authority exercised without anger had altered the dynamic in ways argument never could. The adjustments she had made were not punitive. They were protective. And as the season deepened and the first frost edged the grass in silver, Margaret understood that dignity, once reclaimed, changes the tone of every conversation that follows. By early December, the temperature had dropped below 40 degrees most mornings, and a thin frost traced delicate patterns along Margaret's front steps. The holiday season approached with its familiar expectations, yet this year the invitations arrived with an unfamiliar tone. Daniel called one evening to ask whether she would consider hosting Christmas Eve dinner at her house, as she had done for decades. His voice carried a careful humility, stripped of the casual entitlement that once colored it. Margaret listened without immediate response. She understood the symbolism in the request. Hosting was not merely about food or tradition. It was about acknowledgement. She told him she would think about it and promised an answer by the weekend. After the call ended, she walked slowly through her dining room, running her fingers lightly across the polished surface of the long oak table that had witnessed birthdays, graduations, and quiet reconciliations. Every seat around it had meaning. Every placement communicated something unspoken. She did not rush her decision. The following afternoon, she received a handwritten note delivered by mail, not a text, not an email. The envelope bore Olivia's careful script. Inside, Olivia expressed regret for the discomfort caused at the wedding and acknowledged that humor, when misplaced, can wound rather than lighten. The apology did not contain excuses. It did not attempt to reinterpret events. It simply recognized them. Margaret read the note twice, then folded it neatly and placed it beside the folder containing the trust documents. That evening she called Daniel back and told him that Christmas Eve would take place at her home, as it always had. She added one condition. The seating arrangement would remain unchanged from previous years, with each place set intentionally and respectfully. Daniel agreed without hesitation. On Christmas Eve the house glowed with soft candlelight and the scent of rosemary and roasted turkey. Margaret had arranged the table with deliberate care, placing Daniel and Olivia beside her rather than across the room. The gesture was subtle but intentional. Conversation flowed cautiously at first, then more naturally as the evening progressed. Olivia complimented the meal sincerely. Daniel offered to help clear the dishes without being prompted. Small corrections, Margaret observed, often signal larger shifts. When dessert was served, Margaret stood briefly and thanked her guests for honoring tradition and for understanding that respect sustains family far longer than convenience. No one laughed nervously. No one dismissed her words as overly serious. They listened. Later, as coats were gathered and farewells exchanged, Olivia embraced her lightly and thanked her for welcoming them. The gratitude felt genuine. After the door closed and the house returned to quiet, Margaret extinguished the candles one by one. She did not consider the evening a triumph. She considered it balance restored. Authority had not been exercised to punish but to clarify. The trust remained amended, the conditions intact, yet the atmosphere had softened through accountability rather than denial. Standing alone in the gentle afterglow of the evening, Margaret understood that respect, once reestablished, reshapes more than financial arrangements. It reshapes posture, tone, and intention. And for the first time since the wedding, the silence in her home felt not heavy, but steady. Winter settled fully over Connecticut by late January, the trees outside Margaret's home standing bare and dignified against a pale sky. Snow fell in quiet intervals, covering the lawn in a smooth, unbroken layer that erased footprints as quickly as they appeared. Inside, The house remained warm and orderly, its silence no longer heavy but reflective. The weeks following Christmas had unfolded with steady civility. Daniel called regularly, not out of obligation but intention. Olivia sent photographs from small gatherings, always including a brief message that acknowledged Margaret's place in their plans. The adjustments were not dramatic. They were consistent. Margaret observed the change without exaggeration. She understood that true correction reveals itself through repetition. One afternoon, Daniel visited alone, arriving just after 3 o'clock with a container of coffee from the bakery near her home. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and spoke with an honesty that felt less rehearsed than before. He admitted that he had mistaken confidence for independence, that he had confused modern humor with dismissal. He told her he had not recognized how small moments accumulate. Margaret listened, her expression calm, her hands wrapped loosely around her mug. She did not remind him of specific details. She did not recount the seating or the laughter. She simply said that character is revealed in how one treats those who have nothing to prove. Daniel nodded slowly. He asked about the trust again, not with demand but with curiosity. Margaret explained that the amendments would remain, not as punishment, but as structure. She said that stability is healthiest when it rests on accountability. He accepted this without argument. Before leaving, he paused at the doorway and thanked her for not reacting in anger that night. Margaret answered that restraint is not weakness. It is choice. After he left, she stood at the window watching his car disappear down the quiet street. The snow had begun again, soft flakes drifting downward in patient silence. She reflected on the months that had passed since the reception. What had begun as a public attempt to reduce her presence had ultimately clarified her authority. She had not needed confrontation. She had not required raised voices. She had required alignment. In early March, she received confirmation from Harold Stein that all legal revisions were finalized and secured. The trust stood intact, its conditions clear. Margaret placed the confirmation letter in her desk drawer and closed it gently. That evening, she prepared a simple dinner for herself, setting the table with care even though no one else would join her. She lit a single candle, not out of loneliness but out of habit. As the flames steadied, she considered how easily dignity can be tested and how quietly it can be reclaimed. Respect, she understood now more than ever, is not requested. It is demonstrated. And when it is withheld, the response need not be dramatic. It need only be deliberate. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the ground in clean white. Inside, Margaret sat with composed certainty, aware that every seat at her table would remain exactly where it belonged.